Cast your mind back to the heavyweight boxing landscape of the late 70s and early 80s, and some big names come to mind. You're probably thinking of the likes Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, Joe Frazier, Larry Holmes, and then the young Mike Tyson who took over the division after he burst onto the scene once those guys disappeared. But one of the names you might not think of immediately is Trevor Berbick, and that's because, next to the other names of his era, his achievements inside the boxing ring were relatively modest. However, outside the ring, he lived a life of controversy, contradiction, and in the end, tragedy. And this is his story. For those less familiar with Trevor Berbick's career, let's start with a quick recap. Berbick was born in Port Antonio, Jamaica. He was physically gifted with natural athleticism, but he came to boxing late, only taking it up when he was 19. He first learned to box as an immigrant worker in Guantanamo Bay. At the time, the U.S. military base there was a staging post for soldiers about to be shipped out to the Vietnam War, and for those returning, often with physical or mental scars. It was a violent place at a violent time, and Berbick quickly had to learn how to handle himself. One night after getting into a fight with a drunk Marine, a fight he won, he was invited to try out at the military boxing gym. And once there, he quickly discovered his abilities went beyond just being able to handle himself. It turned out fighting was something he was good at, but unfortunately for him, becoming a boxer in the ring was never enough to keep him out of trouble outside of it. After a handful of amateur bouts, he was selected to represent Jamaica at the 1975 Pan American Games, where he took bronze, and then the 1976 Olympic Games. After joining the pro ranks, he then scored a shock victory over John Tate in his 17th fight, an unexpected win that landed him the chance to fight Larry Holmes for the world title a couple of fights later. He lost, but their bout marked the start of a feud between the two men that would simmer for the next 10 years until it finally boiled over, in spectacular fashion. Even back then, his temper and his unpredictable behavior were already beginning to cause Berbick trouble. But we'll get to that in just a moment. 2 fights after his loss to Holmes, he entered the ring to face Muhammad Ali, writing his name into boxing history as the last man to face the greatest in a professional bout. Few boxing fans have happy memories of that fight. Ali was way past his best and took a pasting from Berbick, a man who wouldn't have stood a chance against Ali in his prime. The beating Berbick administered was tough to watch, and it was the fight that finally caused Ali to hang up the gloves for good. It was a sad way to see him bow out, and if you want to look up classic Ali fights to watch, you're probably better putting this one way down on your list. After a couple more good wins, Berbick was given a second shot at the title, this time against Pinkalon Thomas. He took the W and was crowned heavyweight champ. This was to be the high point of his boxing career, but after that fight, his life seemed to spiral ever more out of control. He lost the belt in his very next fight in an iconic matchup against Mike Tyson. In that bout, Tyson famously took just 2 rounds to destroy Berbick, becoming the youngest heavyweight world champion in history in the process. Berbick was much diminished after this fight, and although he boxed on, he never again came close to competing for heavyweight glory. Worse, though, was how Berbick's life seemed to unravel from this point on, and his behavior became increasingly erratic, and events surrounding Berbick became ever more shocking. 10 years after the loss to Holmes, the public beef between the pair finally came to a head when the two were involved in a street brawl. After having lost to Tyson himself 3.5 years earlier, Holmes was celebrating a comeback win at a low-key presser when Berbick hijacked proceedings. With the press conference wrapping up, Berbick began hurling wild accusations at Holmes, saying Holmes had been seeing a prostitute and that he was trying to destroy both Berbick's career and his marriage. The two quickly came to blows before being separated as matters spilled out onto the street in front of the hotel where Holmes's fight had taken place. And then what happened next must rank as one of the craziest moments in the last half-century of boxing history. And in a sport that is no stranger to insanity and unexpected surprises, that's saying something. With Berbick continuing an unhinged rant outside the hotel to the gathered members of the press and anybody else who cared to listen, Holmes jumped up onto a car parked next to Berbick, bounded over its roof, and launched himself into the air at his enemy. Holmes landed on Berbick with a WWE-style flying kick, sending him sprawling. The two were then separated again with onlookers standing around in disbelief, visibly stunned. It may have been Holmes who had jumped on the car and leapt into the air to attack Berbick, but Berbick had been the one to turn up at the presser to goad Holmes. This was by no means an isolated case of bad behavior by Berbick, though, and it was far from the worst thing he was accused of during his life. At around the same time, he had been on trial for raping his children's babysitter. He was convicted of this crime the year after the incident with Holmes, and as a result, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was released on parole after serving just 15 months, but then, perhaps predictably, he was caught violating his parole and was deported from the U.S. to Jamaica. He then tried to move back to Canada, where he had settled at the start of his professional career, but Canada also tried to deport him, although he fought this decision and was ultimately allowed to stay. His rape conviction was the worst of his crimes and the lowest point of his life, but it was hardly the only time he found himself in trouble with the law. He had previously been arrested for assaulting a man he believed to be having an affair with his wife. She subsequently divorced him. He also assaulted his former manager, threatening him by pushing a gun into his mouth, and he was found guilty of fraud when he forged his ex-wife's signature when applying for a mortgage. Later, he was also tried for not paying his income tax bills, and to make matters worse, he then fell asleep during the trial. At this point, with this kind of self-destructive behavior growing ever more common with Berbick, you almost feel like he was trying to get into trouble. And still he continued to box until he was finally forced to retire when a scan found a blood clot on his brain. Following this, he was once again deported back to Jamaica from the U.S. after more bother with the law, and the final act in his turbulent life story was to come just a few short years later. In 2006, 6 years after his retirement and 4 years after being deported back to Jamaica for the last time, he was assaulted in Port Antonio, suffering serious blows to the head from a lead pipe. He died of his injuries at the scene. The man convicted of his murder was his 20-year-old nephew, Harold Berbick. Another man was convicted of manslaughter alongside him, having acted as an accomplice. Apparently, the murder occurred over a disagreement about some land. Having come from humble beginnings, he had managed to reach the pinnacle of boxing and capture the world heavyweight title. Despite not being able to successfully defend his title even once, this is still something only very few can ever claim to have achieved. He will be remembered as the last man to fight Ali as well as the man to lose to the unstoppable force that was Mike Tyson, as he set about cleaning up the division in record time, having exploded onto the scene barely into his 20s. He was also the only man to fight all three of Ali, Holmes, and Tyson, so he earned a place in the annals of boxing history, even if it wasn't necessarily for the great victories he scored. As a boxer, he was known for his natural skill and athleticism in the ring, his ability to take a shot, and his heavy-handed punches. However, he will also be remembered just as much, if not more, as a volatile, unpredictable character who always seemed to be involved in controversy wherever he went. Berbick supposedly found God at the age of 16, and later in life, he even became a preacher. However, his faith was not enough to keep him out of trouble, and his violent death was perhaps just the kind of inevitable final chapter that the Trevor Berbick story was always destined to have.